Since 2011, GCFI and NOAA's Coral Reef Conservation Program have worked with a group of 9 priority coral reef marine protected areas in the Caribbean's Mesoamerican reef region to build MPA management capacity and to enhance coral reef resilience. One of the sites is Parque Nacional Arrecifes de Xcalak, or Xcalak Reefs National Park, managed by the Mexican National Parks Commission, CONANP, and located in the southern Yucatan Peninsula near the Mexican border with Belize. In 2015 to 2016, Bob Glazer assisted the park with a study to evaluate likely impacts of a changing climate on the Xcalak lobster fishing community. Here he presents the findings at the 69th GCFI meeting in Grand Cayman, in GCFI's first ever special session on climate change and adaptation, which was sponsored by GCFI and the Department of the Environment of the Cayman Islands.
So I'm going to talk a little bit about this project that we had with some funding from NOAA, GCFI did, where we were looking at what the possible effects of climate change might be on the fishery, on the lobster fishery in Xcalak, Mexico. This was a very rapid assessment, and we didn't get a chance to go into depth very deeply, but it is sort of you can see the template that we use, which is the same thing that we used for terrestrial climate change adaptation in Florida as well as marine adaptation. And the idea is to try to understand what would happen under different climate change scenarios and what the different options would be for managers. In this case, we were trying to develop a communications plan and a monitoring plan for CONANP. So just for some spatial reference, Xcalak is near Chetumal, Mexico, on the Yucatan, and on the right-hand pane, you can see it's near Bacalar Chico in Belize. It is a marine protected area, and it's very closely located to Banco Chinchorro, offshore in Mexico. And here they are again. There's Banco Chinchorro. On the lower, these dots represent the population. So Xcalak is down on the bottom, 375 people. Mahahuil is 920 people, pretty much right across from Banco Chinchorro. So it's a pretty sparsely populated coast. And as we started in on this project, we learned quickly that any examination of the Xcalak lobster fishery really required an examination of the Chinchorro lobster population, because they fished in those different locations from the same fishing fleet. So this is the approach that we used. We wanted to first identify the current state of the lobster fishing, including how they accomplish it. We wanted to examine the existing knowledge on what the climate effects are in this part of the world, examine how they may impact the lobster biology, the ecology, and distribution of the population, and then what that meant to the people fishing, and then provide that communications plan. Ultimately, what we would like to do is provide adaptation options, but I don't think I have time enough to discuss that in this talk, and I'd be glad to afterwards. So when we started talking about characterizing the Xcalak Chinchorro lobster fishery, we started looking at the different ways that they fish for lobsters. I should mention that the lobster fishery of Chinchorro has been given a sustainability rating by Marine Stewardship Council, which means that they are harvesting sustainably according to their standards, which are pretty tight. So it's a pretty well regulated fishery. Their management approaches are based upon what the lobster fishers themselves asked for in management. So it's snorkeling only. That maximum 25 meters is what I was told is about how deep they go in their snorkeling efforts to catch lobsters. The season is the 1st of July through the 28th of February. Now this is interesting because lobster tails are landed in Xcalak, but live lobsters are landed in Mahahuil. So they land them very differently, and they have different price approaches when they start looking at that. They land to a cooperative in Xcalak, but in Mahahuil, they bring them in live and load them directly onto a truck, which is in the bottom frame on the right. So that's landed, they go into a refrigerated truck, and then they go off to all of the resorts along the Yucatan coast. And they're mostly around 25-foot boats that are engaged in this activity. Those 25-foot boats go out to Chinchorro. So now I'd like to talk a little bit about what we know about climate change in terms of the models and what they're telling us about this part of the region. I got this information from 5Cs, the Caribbean Climate Change Community Center, I think. It's close anyway. And this is what we're talking about, what we can expect. So relative to sea level rise, we can expect 13 centimeters or 5 inches by 2030, 28 centimeters, 11 inches by 2050, and 40 inches by the end of the century. And what does that mean? On the right-hand column, it means increased flooding, increased coastal erosion, and saline intrusion into aquifers. Air temperatures we can expect to be about half a degree warmer. That's the low end. Then on the right, you can see the impacts that are associated with that: human health, increased air conditioning, and sea surface temperatures and storms, and some other very important impacts will occur. Sea surface temperature, it's already risen 3/4 of a degree this century. They're expecting 1 to 2 degrees Celsius. This can have a big impact and effect on lobster populations, their distribution, and their abundance. And these are the kinds of things that we look at when we try to evaluate what it means for the fishing and fisheries. So if it gets 1.5 degrees higher than the normal maximum, the corals will bleach and we'll have increased coral diseases. But above about 31 degrees Celsius, there are all kinds of biological and metabolic processes that start to degrade and cause problems at the physiological level. Here's some more rainfall patterns. We expect it to decrease by 20% in most of the CARICOM countries and Mexico. I think they're already seeing that, which means increased demand for water, reduction in water quality, reduced rainfall. I'm going to get back to this and what that means for lobsters. Storm patterns are likely to get less frequent but stronger. That's what the models are saying. That's, 5 years ago people were saying more frequent and stronger, but now they're saying less frequent but stronger. And you might have heard a little discussion this morning about the North Atlantic Oscillation and what it means for storms coming into the Caribbean. So combined with sea level rise, increased coastal erosion will lead to higher surge, especially with storms, and increased flooding, obviously. And the El Nino, we heard that Libby talk about that this morning. Storms will likely get less frequent but more severe when they occur, and it could be wetter in La Nina, drier in El Ninos, things like that. And every one of these has an implication either on the lobster biology, lobster distribution, the fishing community, the way they fish, or other impacts. So let's talk about the impacts on lobsters from those particular climate impacts. So if we're talking about sea level rise, I sort of broke it out into different categories. Biology, no impact likely from sea level rise. But ecology and distribution is what may happen is, and this is these are, one of the benefits of doing this kind of approach is you see where the gaps are in the knowledge. And so you can start targeting investigations to try to reduce the uncertainty associated with a lot of these questions. But what we're expecting is that there will be, at least in the short term, increased flooding, which may, or increased sea level rise will lead to areas that actually have enhanced recruitment. In Florida Keys, we actually saw areas that were previously highly saline and high temperatures, overwashing and reducing salinity and reducing temperatures, thereby actually benefiting juvenile lobsters. So there could be some beneficial effects. Sea surface temperature, let's see, again, that 31 degrees Celsius is the threshold beyond which certain metabolic processes break down. Juvenile lobsters, relative to the ecology and distribution, higher mortality for post-larva lobsters, adult lobsters, half a degree Celsius in Belize. They've done some experiments and seen lobsters migrate further offshore into deeper waters with half a degree Celsius increase. And relative to the demographics, it's likely that we will see a redistribution in how or a change in the distribution of how the lobster population is located in the landscape and on the seascape. They may be moving from the Chinchorro lagoon offshore into deeper waters, which will impact the fishing to a certain extent. And more on this. Impacts on lobsters, decreases in rainfall, increased salinity, which can exceed thresholds, and lobsters will have to change their behavior because of that. And that will fall into the distribution column or cell. Increase in storm intensity, the biology, rapid decrease in salinity can lead to mass mortality if there's a large rain event, and a decrease in salinity below certain thresholds. So they will need to be able to respond quickly. And it's likely, as I put there, to force lobsters into deeper waters. And in fact, in Siancán in 2013, they had a lot of rain, which did two things. One is it forced lobsters further offshore, and the second, this relates to what I'm going to be speaking about coming up, is it reduced visibility, so they weren't able to snorkel as efficiently and thereby reduced the CPUE after those rain events. So this is what Xcalak looks like on the shore. I don't know why I put that in there, except that it's a nice picture. Here's Chinchorro. This is how some of the fishermen fish off of Chinchorro. Some of them are right on the island, on the ground. This is interesting because when you talk about adaptation and how populations can adapt to rising seas, generally, when you talk about the built environment, they don't have the kind of flexibility that allows them to constantly adjust where they're living. But this kind of, obviously, this kind of situation, they are fairly adaptive, and their responses can be fairly rapid to any kind of rising seas to get above the sea level. So that's actually a pretty cool, they're actually pretty resilient to that kind of effect. So this is a map of sea level rise. The yellow represents areas that are 1 meter or less. At 1 meter or less, that's the best that we could get with the digital elevation models. The blue in the little lakes in there is actually below sea level. This is a very, very low-lying area, and along the coast, it's very vulnerable to erosion. So what does it mean for the fishing communities? First thing, when we talk about infrastructure, this is the obvious stuff: increased flooding of the Xcalak cooperative, because that's on land. Little impact to lobsters landed in Mahahuil. They have a nice port and a nice dock that's fairly high. And housing in Chinchorro, which I just showed there, may become flooded, but they are able to adapt to that kind of thing. And so what I put on the right-hand column is their ability to adapt. So this is sort of, they can adapt with the housing, but the flooding in the Xcalak cooperative is a negative. So that's what the minus is. So it's plus and minus in that particular cell. I don't think there's a plus and minus coming up anywhere else. So fishing practices, there are likely few impacts. Lobster catch relative to sea level rise. There may be increased recruitment, which may lead to increased catch in shallow waters inside of the lagoon. That could be net positive. Increase in sea surface temperature infrastructure. Likely no impact from sea surface temperature increases. Fishing practices, lobsters decrease in abundance inside lagoon, thereby leading to increased fishing outside in the deeper waters, which are less accessible and also more exposed to storms and poor conditions. So that's a net negative. Lobster catch, lobster moving deeper, which would lower the CPUE because it's more difficult to get to that location. And there could be chronic health impacts on the lobsters, which could also lead to lower abundance and lower CPUE. Page 2, decrease in rainfall. So relative to infrastructure, as we talked about before, it can lead to saltwater intrusion, which could impact the mainland Xcalak fishing community. And fishers out on Chinchorro bring their own water. They'll have to either bring more water or they're going to have to come back to land more often. So that's an impact. Fishing practices, decreased rainfall will result in increased salinity, forcing lobsters further offshore. And so the other thing is it in this cell? Lobster catch. It's in the lobster catch. Lobster catch may be negatively impacted by changes in locations of lobsters, but on the other hand, it actually may be a net benefit because there'll be less days of poor visibility. So they'll be able to fish more often with increased visibility and therefore a higher catch rate, increased CPUE. Increase in storm intensity. Infrastructure obviously is vulnerable. Fishing practices, I think this is all pretty obvious. Lobster catch, I think that's pretty obvious. Oh, I'm blinking. So I'm just going to real quickly go through this. CONANP asked us to produce two plans, a communications plan and a monitoring plan. And we figured we could roll them all into one. The communications plan is designed to let the fishers know what the effects are of climate change, and the monitoring plan would be for the CONANP scientists to know when they would need to implement adaptation options, which is a whole different and long discussion. But those two things together, we figured in the sense of SOCMON, we could do with three very simple questions. And this will be a discussion with the managers and the fishers. They don't have to have a long 20-item questionnaire. They could just sort of have this discussion with them and ask them, to talk about how fishing has changed, how it may be expected to change, and what changes they have seen that have impacted their fishing. And the information that you're trying to get across is that this climate could be impacting that. And then in terms of monitoring, it's what has changed, what kinds of things are changing. So they could ask those questions, write them down, and know exactly what's changed, and without going through a long and boring questionnaire, or talk for that matter. The second discussion point is, where do they fish for lobsters and how has that changed? And so, you saw what the impacts are, what things can change near shore based upon changes in rainfall, increased sea level rise, increased sea surface temperature. So you have a discussion on that, and you ask those kinds of questions. Have their areas that they wanted to fish in become more accessible or less accessible? Is it windier? Can they not get out as much? Is the visibility lower? Those are the kinds of questions you can ask them to try to understand what it means for that kind of fishing. And here's the last discussion point. What changes have they seen in the coastal zone, and how will that impact their infrastructure? And how then, these are sort of jumping off points to adaptation questions, which, as I mentioned, is not part of this. But those are the kinds of questions and discussions that you can have that will help both communicate the effects of climate change to people who might not be as scientifically informed on the subject, but probably have more sense of it than most of us, and at least in regards to change. And it may also help the managers develop robust adaptation options. And so I want to thank actually a couple NOAA people here who have helped fund this, Eileen Alicia and Dana Wusenik. Hey, Dana. I don't see Eileen. Anyway, they helped fund this is a very small part of a much larger project.
Thanks for watching. We look forward to seeing you at the 70th Annual GCFI meeting in Merida, Mexico on November 6 to 10, 2017.